The American Legion Hall in Hondo, Texas, hadn't changed much since the mid-70s. The floorboards creaked the same. The scent of coffee and old varnish still clung to the walls like a memory. Rows of folding chairs stood neatly in front of a makeshift stage that used to host swing band nights, war story panels, and the occasional poker game when no one was watching. But today was different. A bright red banner stretched across the front wall, Heroes Through Time Martial Arts Appreciation Day. It was a local thing, sponsored by a nearby dojo and a couple of retired vets who'd once taught kids discipline through kata and kindness. Most folks came out of respect, curiosity, or the promise of free chili dogs. Some came for the nostalgia. A few came to show off. That morning, a man stepped quietly through the side door. He wasn't flashy. Jeans, faded boots, and a light jacket worn from years of sun and memory. He took his seat in the far back corner, didn't shake hands, didn't smile too wide, just nodded to the few who glanced his way and settled in like a man who didn't need to be noticed. Up near the front, the energy was louder, younger. Jay Carter was the kind of young man who carried himself like a billboard. Tight shirt stretched across a chest he made sure everyone saw. Every muscle was a headline. His hair was styled, his shoes spotless, and his phone sat perfectly centered on a tripod with a little mic clipped to his collar. He had followers, he said, thousands of them. Some even liked his video about punching through 3 boards while quoting Aristotle. Misquoted, but no one corrected him. He bounced on his heels like the mat couldn't hold him still. He'd been invited as the final demo for the day. A modern practitioner, the flyer said. One of the organizers, a sweet lady named Irene, had watched him on YouTube and thought he'd bring energy. He did. Just not the kind anyone expected. A few vets had already performed. One showed traditional Okinawan kata, his arms moving with the memory of war and years of peace. Another, old and limping, had spoken about the importance of stillness before action. No one clapped too hard. It wasn't that kind of crowd, just head nods and shared glances of respect, quiet affirmation. Jay stepped onto the mat with a grin that reached his ears. His intro music blasted from a portable speaker he brought himself. Heavy beats, too loud for the room. The sound made a few heads turn with more confusion than enthusiasm. He launched into a whirlwind of spinning kicks and air punches. Every move is bigger than the last. He spoke between flurries. It is not about discipline or form, but about power, confidence, and getting what you want from the world before the world eats you alive. A few folks shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others squinted, trying to understand if this was performance or parody. Then it got worse. Jay paused mid-set and smirked toward the crowd. He pointed to one of the older men sitting near the front. The man was in a wheelchair, a Vietnam veteran hat resting proudly on his knees. Jay cocked his head. Some of y'all probably think I'm disrespecting tradition, huh? The thing is, real warriors don't sit still. They adapt, they evolve. They don't just sit back and tell stories about what they used to do. They show it, they live it. The room didn't laugh. Jay laughed enough for all of them. The veteran in the chair didn't blink, didn't flinch, just rested his hand over his folded cap and stared straight ahead. Chuck Norris, still seated in the back, finally looked up. There was a long second where nothing happened. Jay kept talking, filling the silence with noise, but something in the air shifted like the air got thicker, like the light stopped bouncing right. A couple of the old men exchanged glances. Irene looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Jay spun again, yelling out a final burst of action and throwing a high kick that came just inches from the edge of the mat. Then he paused, chest heaving, arms wide, like he expected thunderous applause. None came. Chuck remained seated. His eyes, once lowered, now locked gently on Jay. Not a glare, not a challenge, just a long, patient look, like a grandfather watching a toddler knock over a stack of blocks and call it architecture. In the row behind Chuck, a man leaned slightly forward. He wore an old leather jacket, one elbow patched with duct tape, the kind of guy who'd probably fixed more lawnmowers than he cared to admit. His voice was barely a whisper. "Is that who I think it is?" The man beside him shrugged, but his gaze was locked on Chuck, who now lowered his eyes again, back into calm. The whisperer leaned back, folded his arms. Damn. Jay, still riding his high, walked toward the edge of the mat and spoke again. "See, folks, we've had a lot of great performances today. Respect to all of them. Really. But martial arts ain't about looking back. It's about dominance, control, owning the room." He waved his hand dismissively at the older performers. Stories don't win fights. Speed, precision, power, that's what matters now. Chuck didn't move. A boy in the second row looked over at him and tugged on his mother's sleeve. She leaned down as he whispered something, pointing quietly. She looked too, then turned back to the front without a word, her eyes a little wider. Jay gave a final nod, threw a fist in the air, and stepped off the mat. He grabbed his phone, hit stop on the recording, and winked at a teenage girl near the snacks table. Back near the folding chairs, a few veterans stood slowly. One of them, the man with the duct-taped elbow, turned to the guy beside him. "Have you ever heard about that story from '91, the one in El Paso? Guy walked into a dojo full of hotshots, didn't say a word. He took off his boots, bowed, and then left 20 minutes later, without laying a finger on anyone. But nobody forgot it." The man next to him raised an eyebrow. "I heard he taught the guy who runs that Marine Corps program now, the one about awareness and restraint." He paused. He had a name. Don't think anyone ever said it out loud, but it started with a C. They both looked again at the man in the back. Chuck sat still, hands folded, shoulders soft, not bored, not angry, just listening, waiting. Jay, meanwhile, was back by the snack table talking loudly again. Something about a seminar he is holding in Austin next weekend. Something about being the next generation of martial philosophy. The room didn't answer him. A quiet settled over the hall as Irene stepped back up to the mic. Her hands shook slightly. She didn't know what to say, so she didn't say much. "Thank you all for coming today. Please stick around. There's chili in the back." Chuck stood quietly. He turned toward the exit and nodded once at Irene as he passed. She nodded back, slower. As he reached the door, the same boy who had pointed earlier broke from his mother and walked a few steps forward. "Sir," the boy asked gently. Chuck stopped, looked down. The boy stared up at him with wide eyes. "Did you used to fight?" Chuck smiled. "Not big, just enough." The boy waited for an answer, but none came. Chuck placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, held it there for a second, then walked out into the sunlight. Back inside, the boy turned around and whispered to his mom. "I think that was him." His mom nodded, but didn't speak. The man with the duct-taped elbow leaned over to Irene as she turned off the mic. "You might want to call Jay back. Tomorrow. He's going to want to rethink everything he just said." Irene nodded. "Who is he?" she asked. The man shook his head, slowly, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "That's not the question. Then what is—" The man looked toward the door, where sunlight still streamed through the closing crack. The question is, who does he choose to be now? He never meant to be famous, not in the way the world thinks of fame. Back then, in the late 50s, Chuck Norris was just another young man with a quiet stare and a firm handshake, boarding a plane to Korea, wearing boots too new and a uniform too stiff. The Air Force gave him a number, a rank, and a direction. What he found overseas would shape every breath he took for the rest of his life. At Osan Air Base, far from Texas, the days start early and ended even earlier for those who didn't adjust. Most of the other guys blew off steam with cards or pool. Chuck stayed to himself, polite, focused. He wasn't one to brag or bark orders. But some nights, long after chow, you'd find him on a side lot near the old hangar, practicing kicks in the moonlight. Not showy stuff, just steady, silent motion. He didn't talk about it. He just did it. That's how the right people noticed. A senior sergeant from Intel started showing up, watched quietly from behind the rusted fuel barrels. Then came a few others. Word passed between ranks. This kid had something. Not just the technique, but the patience to sharpen it without applause. In a place full of noise and nerves, that kind of discipline stood out. When a few higher-ups asked if he could teach hand-to-hand for security detail, he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a title. He just showed up on time and ran the drills as if it were his duty. The guys started calling it Norris Hour. No yelling, no wasted motion. He taught breathing before blocking, eye contact before engagement. The first lesson always stuck. If you can talk them down, do it. If not, make sure they don't get back up. He never smiled when he said it. It wasn't a threat. It was a responsibility. They started calling him the Ghost with Hands after an incident that no one had put in the reports. A break-in near the restricted hangars. 2 intruders. No weapons drawn. But by the time backup arrived, both men were lying flat breathing, but unconscious. No bruises visible. No marks on Chuck. The base commander asked how it happened. Chuck just said they tripped. No one argued. What set him apart wasn't speed. Plenty of guys were fast. It wasn't strength either. Chuck wasn't the biggest in the unit. What he had was control. Total exacting control. He moved like he already knew what the other man was going to do, and didn't want to waste either of their time proving it. In practice, he could disarm a partner mid-lunge, then offer a hand to help him up before he hit the mat. In the field, he made choices quickly and precisely, never chasing a fight, but always ending one. There was a story from Daegu. Training exercise gone wrong. A young private panicked and pulled a live round into a drill. Chuck stepped in, disarmed the boy, and calmed the room, all before anyone else even realized something was off. No shout. No panic. Just movement. Afterward, the private said the air got cold, and everything slowed down. Like time held its breath for him. That's when people stopped calling him by rank and started calling him Ghost. Still, he never let it swell his head. When letters came from home, he read them alone, folded them neatly, and placed them in the same inside pocket of his jacket. Every letter got the same treatment. A nod, a quiet moment, then back to work. Discipline wasn't something he turned on and off. It was how he walked, how he slept, how he showed up early to every meal, and never took the first plate. Toward the end of his deployment, the brass asked if he'd consider staying on to lead combative training across bases. He respectfully declined. He said he'd done his part. There was a country waiting for him back home, a mother who prayed over every sunrise, and a younger brother who kept getting into trouble with the local boys. He didn't say it, but some part of him knew his fight wasn't meant to be locked on a base forever. There were other places where patience, discipline, and presence were needed. When he left, there was no ceremony, just a few firm handshakes, a folded flag, and a nod from the senior sergeant who had first watched him behind the barrels. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Back in the States, he settled in quietly, didn't chase glory, didn't jump into the fight game, started small teaching kids in community centers how to breathe before they reacted. Parents noticed the difference. Fewer broken noses, more steady hearts. He wasn't a ghost anymore, but he still moved like one. What the men who served with him remembered wasn't just the fights he won. It was the way he waited for the right moment. The way he taught without raising his voice. The way he never cared for attention, only accountability. Long before his name became a legend, before the jokes and the posters and the movie roles, he was just Chuck. A kid from Oklahoma who went to Korea and found something solid inside himself. Something no spotlight could create. His legacy didn't start with fame. It started in silence, in the quiet corner of a hangar under a thin wash of moonlight, where a young man practiced kicks, not for show, but for clarity. And in the hush after a fight, when even the ones who lost felt somehow respected. That's the part no one writes about. But the men who served beside him remember, and they still whisper his name. Not because he asked them to, but because some legacies don't have to be loud to last. They say the mission never made it into any report. Not fully. These are just coded mentions in the logs buried under phrases like unexpected contact or detour due to terrain. But the men who were there still talk about it late at night when their drinks are slow and the lights are dim. They don't speak in long sentences, just looks, nods, and a quiet phrase that always comes back the same way. He didn't even draw a weapon. It happened near the end of Chuck's second year in country. A convoy was making its way through a narrow canyon outside Paju, escorting radio equipment to a forward post. The intel said it was clear. It wasn't. The canyon turned out to be a funnel. On one side, steep rock walls. On the other hand, dense woods that swallowed sound. When the first shot rang out, it wasn't loud. It was precise. The lead vehicle lost a tire. Then came the echo. Then smoke. No one screamed. There wasn't time. Chuck was in the second Humvee riding shotgun next to a new driver who had more confidence than Miles. The kid froze, hands glued to the wheel and eyes locked forward as the canyon walls closed in. Chuck didn't freeze. He opened the door and stepped out before the others even unbuckled. No weapon drawn. His boots were just hitting gravel, and his eyes were scanning the ridge. He moved low, but without panic, as if he'd rehearsed this scene 100 times. In a way, he had. Not this exact canyon, but the pattern. The rhythm of fear was trying to pull good men under before they remembered how to breathe. 3 of the rear guards took cover behind the third vehicle. One shouted something that got swallowed by the rocks. Chuck didn't answer. He motioned with his hand, flat, steady, not rushed, and crept forward along the left wall, where the shadows ran deeper. Then he disappeared. What happened over the next 5 minutes has lived in fragments ever since. Different men remember it differently. Some say he scaled a wall. Others say he found a narrow climb through brush and thorns, using footholds most wouldn't see in daylight. What they all agree on is this. The shooting stopped. The silence returned thick and waiting. And then Chuck walked back down into the canyon, shirt torn at the sleeve dirt across his chest, and his hand held out in front of him. In that hand was a small metal pin, the kind found on certain foreign grenades. He didn't explain how he got it. He just handed it to the squad leader and said the ridge was clear. The men who went up later found 3 unconscious bodies and no signs of struggle. No blood, just impressions in the dirt where boots had slipped and hands had been bound tight. They were enemies, sure, but young, scared, probably sent by someone who never meant to fight face to face. Chuck could have ended them. No one would have blamed him. But he didn't. He neutralized the threat, then left the rest to be handled by protocol. Back at base, the commander wanted a debrief. Chuck kept it short. Said the situation was resolved. When asked if he'd used his sidearm, he shook his head once. That was it. No citation. No commendation. Just another checkbox on a mission sheet. The guys in the unit didn't forget. Especially the ones who might not have made it out without his calm. They started saying it in whispers during training. Watch how he breathes. Ghost doesn't blink. He listens before he moves. And when he moves, it's already too late. There's a photo somewhere. Someone snapped it when the convoy returned. Chuck, standing beside the third vehicle, hands on his hips, squinting at the sun. His boots are scuffed. One pant leg is ripped. You can't see anything dramatic in the picture. No explosion. No fire. Just a man who did his job and didn't need a spotlight to know he'd done it right. He never brought it up afterward. Didn't use it as a teaching tool. Didn't write about it in memoirs. When asked later in life what the hardest part of service was, he always said the same thing. Making sure fear didn't make decisions for you. That canyon, those minutes became a kind of myth. New recruits heard pieces. Some thought it was exaggerated. But the older guys didn't correct them. They just said you weren't there. You didn't see how still he was. You didn't see what silence can do when it's earned. Years later, a retired colonel who had been in that convoy gave a speech at a veterans event. He talked about leadership. It's not always the man shouting orders who saves the day. Sometimes it's the one who steps into chaos without raising his voice, who makes the call without being asked, who chooses to de-escalate when escalation is the easier path. He never said Chuck's name, but those who knew didn't need it spoken. They carried the story with them, not as legend, but as a lesson, that there's more strength in control than in force. That restraint is the weapon of men who've seen too much and don't need to prove anything anymore. Chuck went on to build schools, not brick-and-mortar ones, but places where young people learned to control their bodies and respect their choices. He always started slow, taught the basics, never brought up the past. When kids asked if he ever saw action, he'd smile and say he saw plenty of inaction that saved lives. He didn't live for the frame, for the trophy, for the story that could be packaged and retold with music cuts and flashing edits. His story was real, and the real ones never need to be loud. The canyon's still there, overgrown now, quiet like it was before the trucks rolled in. Locals hike past sometimes, never knowing what happened under that sky. But if they pause just long enough, and the wind shifts the right way, maybe they feel it too. The stillness, the presence of a man who walked toward danger, not to conquer it, but to stop it from spreading, who won without raising his fists, and then walked away without looking back. The letters started arriving not long after he came home. Big studios, small networks, producers, with polished teeth and loud voices. They all wanted a piece of the myth. A show about his life, a limited series, a guest appearance, an action brand. The names kept getting bigger. So did the checks. Chuck read every offer. He didn't tear them up. He didn't curse them. He just folded them, once slid them back into the envelope, and placed them in a shoebox in the back of his closet. They were real, but they didn't belong in the life he was building. He wasn't hiding. He was choosing. And what he chose was the shadows. While the world waited for the next photo op or interview, Chuck walked into small community centers, barely announcing. No red carpet, just a thermos of coffee and a quiet question. How can I help? Most of the time, the folks inside didn't recognize him right away. Just another older man with kind eyes and good posture. He never corrected them. In East San Antonio, he taught self-defense to orphans. Kids whose parents disappeared behind bars, addiction, or the fog of war. He didn't give speeches. He gave time. One of the boys had a habit of flinching every time someone moved too fast. Chuck didn't try to fix it with words. He showed up day after day and never made a sudden move. The boy stopped flinching. Up in Wichita Falls, he sat in circle groups with disabled vets. Not as a leader, not as a speaker. Just a presence. When a man who'd lost both legs said he didn't feel like he existed anymore. Chuck reached over and tightened the man's belt for him. Nothing more. But it said everything. No one took pictures, not because they weren't allowed, but because nobody thought to. That was the air Chuck brought with him. The kind that made people feel like looking someone in the eye mattered more than capturing a moment to share. He turned down a book deal with a 6-figure advance. The publisher wanted a hero's journey, combat stories, training montages, a third-act comeback. Chuck offered them a different draft. 1 chapter, just 2 pages. It was titled, Listen More. The deal fell through. When an interviewer from a national morning show showed up outside his cabin, uninvited, Chuck didn't slam the door. He invited the man in made eggs and asked about his daughter's graduation. After breakfast, the interviewer left without pressing record. That episode never aired. His philosophy was simple. If you're doing something for the sake of being seen doing it, you're not really doing it. Legacy wasn't what people said about you. It was what people felt after you left the room. He bought land outside Kerrville and built a modest training barn. No signs, no website. The floors were swept by the kids who trained there. The rules weren't posted. They were spoken once and lived every day after. No bragging, no disrespect. And you always hold the door. One summer, a girl named Lacey came in through that door. 13. Bruised in more ways than one. Chuck paired her with a boy twice her size. Not to fight, to listen. For the first month, they didn't throw a single punch. They swept floors and sat still. Lacey hated it. Then, one afternoon, the boy reached for a mop she'd already grabbed. She didn't flinch. Chuck watched from the far corner and nodded once. That's how he measured progress, not with belts or rankings, but by the way someone stood a little straighter, spoke a little softer, trusted their breath in a hard moment. Some parents tried to pay him. He refused every time. He said their kids already had enough pressure. Let this be to one place where they don't have to earn affection. He drove an old truck that rattled on the highway. He wore the same boots until the soles faded smooth. He kept a notebook in the glove box with handwritten names of every student he trained. Not scores, not milestones, just names and dates. And sometimes, next to the date, one word. Centered, grounded, open. He believed the quietest moments had the loudest impact. That's what you do when nobody's looking who you really are. That's why he never liked awards. He had a few tucked in a box somewhere. They didn't change anything. At a reunion barbecue for one of the vet centers, a former colonel stood up and toasted Chuck. Called him the best man he ever served with. Said he changed the lives of a dozen men who never got the chance to say thank you. Chuck raised his cup, nodded once, and changed the subject to the ribs. He never avoided the past. He just didn't need to unpack it for attention. His stories lived in the people he'd helped, and the girl who found her voice, and the man who walked without shame, and the boy who learned how to wait before striking. He chose the shadows because they made room for other people's light. Because when you're not trying to stand in front, you can see the ones behind you more clearly. He knew fame was like fog, warm at first, but easy to get lost in. One of the boys from the orphan program grew up to become a counselor for youth on probation. When someone asked him what made him take that path, he didn't name Chuck. He just said, "Someone once showed up for me every time without needing a reason." That was the point. Chuck didn't need credit. He didn't need applause. He just needed to know that the pain he'd seen could turn into something better. That maybe, through quiet effort, someone else wouldn't have to fall as far. He didn't vanish. He just stopped performing. The world kept spinning, and the spotlight found other faces. But in small rooms, on dusty mats, under creaky gym roofs, Chuck kept showing up. Because sometimes the people who make the biggest difference aren't the ones on camera. They're the ones who let you borrow their strength until you remember your own. Jay Carter moved like the mat was his stage, and the spotlight had finally found the right star. He bounced on the balls of his feet, threw a few warm-up punches in the air, and grinned like a man who already knew how the day would end. The small crowd inside the American Legion Hall clapped politely as he stepped forward, muscles tight under a black compression shirt sleeves just short enough to show off his ink. His phone was propped up on a stand, angled just right to catch every move. He glanced at the screen as the red light blinked on. Live. He had a small mic clipped to his collar, not because anyone asked for commentary, just because Jay Carter believed every moment was worth broadcasting. He opened with a joke, something about being the only guy under 40 in the room. Laughter, but only from the back. A few teenagers by the snack table chuckled. The rest of the audience watched in silence, heads tilted, waiting to see what this young man thought he could teach. Jay launched into a spinning back kick, then dropped to one knee with a flourish. The movement was clean, showy. He smiled wider, soaking in the camera, then popped up and addressed the crowd again. Let me guess. Most of you learned martial arts before color television, right back when a punch took 5 minutes to land. A few folks exchanged glances. One woman folded her arms. In the front row, a silver-haired man with deep lines around his mouth leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Jay didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and didn't care. He dropped into another stance, faster this time, barking as he threw a flurry of punches into the air. It was all power and performance. Fast arms, loud voice, no breath between words. Back in the last row, Chuck Norris sat with his arms folded, eyes lowered, not blinking. Jay kept going. They told me I'd be sharing the stage with some veterans. That's cool. But here's the thing. Respect doesn't mean pretending someone still matters when their prime passed before I was born. The silence in the room thickened. No one laughed this time. A few heads turned slowly toward the front, where an older man in a wheelchair sat with his hands folded across a neatly pressed Marine jacket. He didn't blink, just kept looking straight ahead. Jay smiled and walked a little closer to the edge of the mat. I mean, let's be honest. If your knees creak louder than your punches, maybe it's time to retire the black belt and pick up a crossword puzzle. Gasps now, not loud but sharp, the kind that cut through the still air like a blade. Someone near the middle muttered something under their breath. Irene, the event organizer, took a half step forward, but stopped herself. The man in the wheelchair blinked once. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. Chuck lifted his head. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. Just a slow rise of the chin, a change in posture, like the wind shifting direction without warning. His eyes, calm and steady, settled on Jay. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Jay didn't see it at first. He was too busy performing, throwing punches at the air, narrating his own greatness, bouncing like a boxer, preparing for a fight that would never come. But the energy changed. The laughter didn't return. The crowd wasn't following him anymore. They were watching something else, or rather, someone else. Chuck didn't move beyond that first glance, but it was enough. The veterans in the second and third rows leaned slightly forward, like birds sensing the air tighten before storm. Jay slowed. He looked around, confused by the shift. What he asked, flashing another smile. "Come on, I'm just playing. It's all in fun. We're here to honor the old school. No hard feelings, right?" He turned toward the man in the wheelchair and offered a 2-finger salute. "No disrespect, sir. Just keeping it real." The man didn't answer, didn't look at him, just stared ahead, hands still folded. Chuck blinked once. His face didn't change. That moment stretched, long enough for everyone in the room to feel it, like a note held too long in a song waiting for release. But it didn't come. Jay shifted on his feet. He suddenly looked younger, smaller, like a kid who hadn't quite figured out why the room had gone cold. He glanced toward the back, scanning the rows. That's when his eyes met Chuck's. It wasn't anger he saw, not scorn, just presence, the kind that didn't need to rise to be known, the kind that had walked into danger and returned so often it forgot how to announce itself, the kind that didn't flinch, didn't explain, didn't react. Jay opened his mouth. Then it closed it. Chuck tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the moment. Not a challenge, not a warning. Just a mark in time. Like a bookmark placed in a story that wasn't over yet. The boy by the snack table whispered to his mother. She didn't answer. Just watched. The veteran sat upright now, not tense, but aware. Every eye had shifted. The performance was over. Jay swallowed. He gave a small, awkward bow, grabbed his phone off the tripod, and stepped off the mat. The room didn't clap. Irene walked to the front again, clearing her throat softly. "Thank you all for coming. There's hot coffee in the back." Chuck sat still for another minute. Then his eyes returned to the floor, slow and steady. The veteran in the wheelchair glanced once toward the back row, then gave the smallest of nods. Something had shifted in the room that no one could name. Not anger, not revenge, just memory, like something old had stirred, like a boundary had been crossed and a lesson left hanging in the air. Jay Carter didn't speak again that day, but he never forgot the silence that met his last punchline, or the man who answered without saying a single word. Chuck rose without a sound. Not rushed, not slow, just steady, like the decision had been made long before the moment called for it. His hands rested at his sides, his boots pressed gently into the floor. For a second, the room seemed to forget how to breathe. Jay Carter didn't notice at first. He was still fiddling with his phone, probably looking for a clean angle to salvage his live stream. But a whisper ran through the front rows. It wasn't words, just a quiet shift of posture, as if something ancient had just stood up, and the room needed to make space for it. Chuck took one step forward. The air didn't move, but the temperature felt different. He took another. His eyes never left the mat. Jay looked up. At first it was confusion, but then it was recognition. Then something closer to unease, the kind that creeps in before the brain catches up. He blinked, adjusted his stance, and tried to smile. But the smile didn't land. Chuck kept walking. Each step, his careful, silent, and deliberate. Not like a man about to fight, like a man stepping into sacred ground. He didn't look left, didn't glance toward the crowd. Only the mat, only Jay. By the time he reached the edge, the room was still. Chuck paused, then turned his head slowly toward the front row. The man in the wheelchair was still sitting upright, jaw-locked expression unreadable. Chuck bowed. It was small, barely a motion, but no one missed it. The kind of bow that carries more weight than an apology. A gesture that spoke louder than any correction or scolding. Not just respect, reverence. The man in the wheelchair closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded once. Chuck turned again. Now he faced Jay. He didn't raise a hand, didn't shift his stance. He just looked. Jay, who had strutted and joked and spun around like the stage belonged to him, suddenly seemed unsure of where to stand. His shoulders lifted slightly, as if waiting for a cue that wouldn't come. Chuck took one step onto the mat. Jay stepped back. No one spoke. Not the veterans, not the teens, not the organizers, not even the camera guy who'd been filming from the side. Because this wasn't for the crowd. This was something older. Something unspoken. Chuck stood with his feet flat and his back straight. He didn't posture, didn't pose. He was simply there. Jay opened his mouth. Then it closed it. He tried to chuckle, shrugged at the silence, just putting on a showman. But even he didn't believe it now. Chuck tilted his head slightly, not judging, just waiting. It became clear to everyone that there would be no words, no lecture, no story from the past or dramatic reveal. Chuck's presence was the story. His silence was the response, and it echoed louder than anything Jay had said all day. The younger man lowered his gaze for a split second, then looked up again. He squared his shoulders. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt. Chuck didn't move, not even a blink. It wasn't intimidation. It wasn't a challenge. It was the truth. Standing still, waiting to be recognized. The room so full of sound and distraction just moments earlier now felt stripped bare. It was as if all the noise had cleared to make room for a single question. Who are you? When no one's clapping. Jay shifted his feet, tried to reset, but it was too late. The rhythm was gone. The attention had changed shape. It no longer belonged to him. Chuck stepped forward once more. Not close, just near enough. Jay stepped back again, then stopped himself. He looked into Chuck's eyes and found no anger, no fire, just calm. And something else. Accountability. Not forced, not loud, just there. The kind of thing you can't fake, the kind of thing you either carry or you don't. Chuck nodded once, not to Jay, but to the moment. Then he stepped off the mat. He didn't bow again, didn't speak. He walked back to his seat, and the room stayed quiet. Not awkward quiet, but heavy, like something had landed and no one wanted to disturb it. Jay stood alone on the mat, not sure what to do with his hands, not sure what to say. The boy by the snack table whispered something again this time to himself. That's Chuck Norris. No one corrected him, because after that, there wasn't anything else to say. Jay Carter didn't like the silence. It pressed in from every corner of the room, thick, unblinking. He shifted on his feet again, rolling his shoulders like an athlete, trying to shake off the nerves. His mouth curled into a grin, but it didn't sit quite right. Not anymore. The energy had changed, and everyone in the hall knew it. Chuck Norris had said nothing, not a word. But he didn't need to. He had looked, he had bowed, and then he had stood still. That stillness was louder than anything Jay had ever shouted into a camera. The silence made Jay feel like he was shrinking, like the mat beneath his sneakers had turned into something sacred, and he didn't belong on it. So he did what young men sometimes do when the moment gets too heavy. He cracked a joke. Well, all right then. If the legend wants to play, let's play. Some nervous laughter flickered in the back. Not real, just noise looking for cover. Jay kept going. Here's the deal. Just for fun, right? If I win, old man, you walk out of this hall and don't come back. Ever. No hard feelings. You just disappear into the sunset cowboy style. He looked around the room, fishing for a spark. But if you win, he added, voice rising, I'll kneel before every vet in this place. One by one. Cameras rolling. That got a murmur. Not laughter, not gasps. Just the kind of sound people make when they realize something's being set in motion. Something with weight. Jay turned to face Chuck. He dropped into a light stance. Open hands. Playful expression. What do you say, friendly little test? Nothing major. Chuck didn't blink. He didn't twitch. He just looked. The pause stretched. A few of the older veterans leaned forward, not because they were excited, because they were listening. Like the room itself had something to say, and they didn't want to miss it. Jay swallowed once, then cleared his throat. Unless, of course, you're worried about keeping up. The grin came back, but it didn't last, because at that moment, Chuck nodded. Just once. And it hit the room like thunder. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It was quiet, controlled, the kind of yes that didn't ask for applause, the kind of yes that had been forged in places no camera had ever gone. Jay's smirk flickered. For the first time, it wasn't clear whether he was still performing or just trying to hold on to something he couldn't quite feel anymore. Chuck stepped forward again. Just one step. The mat seemed smaller now. A voice from the back said softly, "It's real now." Jay looked around. The veterans didn't move, but their eyes were locked on the center of the room. Irene, still near the stage, held her breath. The kids near the snack table stood frozen, phones forgotten. Jay cleared his throat again. "All right then," he said, trying to make it light. Friendly, like I said. Nothing personal. But even he knew it was personal now. Not anger. Not pride. Something deeper. Legacy. Chuck didn't need the challenge. He didn't care about winning or showing off. But he understood what was at stake. Not reputation, not ego, but memory, respect, and the truth that sometimes a body needs to stand still in order to be felt. Jay moved into his stance. Fast, sharp. He bounced once on his toes. Chuck simply stood. No flourish, no breath control, no eye roll or head tilt, just presence. And with that, the stakes were clear. This wasn't about moves. This wasn't about the crowd. It was about something older, something quiet. And it had just woken up. By the time Chuck Norris stepped off the mat and left the Legion Hall, the whispers had already started. Someone texted a buddy in Houston. Someone else called their son in Florida. Within an hour, a short clip hit social media. It was grainy and shaky, but the title was clear. Chuck Norris accepts challenge from young fighter. Jay Carter posted a reaction video that same night. He stood in front of a mirror with boxing gloves on, talking fast, smiling widely, calling it a dream match. He flexed between sentences, promised fireworks, and even hinted at bringing sponsors to the event. "This is how legends pass the torch," he said, thumbs up to the camera. Meanwhile, Chuck drove home in silence. The road out of town curved through fields that hadn't changed in decades. Cows watched from behind wire fences. The late sun cast long shadows. He didn't turn on the radio, just rolled down the window and let the air carry the weight of the day out of the truck. Back at his cabin, he didn't unpack a gym bag. He didn't pull out training pads or check his phone. He walked to the shed, grabbed an axe, and started splitting wood. There was no hurry in his movements, no tension, just rhythm. The sound of the axe biting into the logs, the thump of fresh splits hitting the stack. His breath matched the work. In, swing, crack, out, reset. That was his warm-up. Back in town, Jay had booked a ring light and a local studio space. He ran a few combos in front of a black backdrop, while music thumped in the background. His coach filmed multiple angles. Jay cracked jokes between takes, then posted stories about training hard, rising fast, and showing respect, kind of. By midnight, the news had spread to martial arts forums. Some said it couldn't be real. Others said it was too good not to be. A few brought up Chuck's age. A few laughed. But the ones who had seen Chuck before the cameras came along didn't laugh. They just shared the clip without comment. Chuck finished stacking the last piece of wood just as the sky darkened. He walked inside and washed his hands. The tea water was already warming on the stove. He opened the tin, spooned in the leaves, and waited. No protein shake, no interviews, no rehearsed monologues. Just tea. He sipped it on the porch while the wind moved through the trees. His dog lay curled by the steps, ears twitching, but quiet. In the distance, a coyote called, once then stopped. Inside the Legion Hall, Irene and 2 other volunteers rolled out mats for the next day. They called the match an exhibition, but everyone knew better. It wasn't about belts or rankings. It wasn't even about the fight. It was about the room, about what had been said, and who had stayed silent. Veterans who hadn't left their homes in months were calling for rides. Teenagers were texting each other asking if it was okay to skip work. A few older martial artists from neighboring towns offered to volunteer. One of them brought an old VHS of Chuck teaching a breathing technique at a camp that no one has remembered until now. Jay posted again at dawn. Shirtless, sweating skipping rope. He called the match Respect Reclaimed. He didn't tag Chuck. He didn't have to. Chuck woke before the sun, as he always did. He boiled more water, folded his flannel shirt with care, laced his boots without a rush. Then he stood for a while at the edge of the porch, eyes steady on the horizon. He didn't stretch. He didn't shadowbox. He didn't record a single thing. He closed the door behind him, got in his truck, and drove into town. At the same moment, Jay was checking angles in the mirror again. The Legion Hall, by noon, would be full. But for now, only the wind and the gravel under Chuck's tires knew what was coming. And that was enough. There was no bell, no referee, no announcer reading names into a microphone. Just 2 men standing on opposite ends of the mat as the Legion Hall held its breath. A quiet hum filled the room, not from noise, but from anticipation. The kind that settled deep in the chest and waited for something to shift. Jay Carter bounced lightly on his feet, his hands loose, his jaw clenched around a smile. He threw a few feints into the air. Quick punches, sharp elbows, movements meant to signal readiness, dominance, and confidence, the kind of energy that grabs attention and doesn't let go. Chuck Norris walked to the center of the mat. He didn't look left or right. He didn't scan the crowd. He just walked slow and steady until he stood exactly in the middle. Then he stopped, planted both feet shoulder-width apart, hands relaxed, chin level, eyes calm. He didn't move again. Jay snuck a glance at the audience, expecting a reaction. A cheer, a laugh, something. But they were still, like Chuck's stillness had poured itself into every corner of the hall. He raised his gloves, took a few steps forward, and shuffled left. He clapped his hands together, trying to summon tension. Nothing. Chuck didn't even blink. Jay gave a short hop, then dropped low into a crouch, testing his opponent's eyes. Still nothing. Not a twitch. Not a shift of weight. Chuck's feet were firm. His heels locked into the mat like they belonged to the earth itself. The quiet began to press on Jay. He threw out a quick jab at the air between them, not close enough to land, but close enough to challenge. The air caught it and gave nothing back. Chuck remained still. Jay started circling, light on his toes, spinning just outside range. His breaths were sharp, controlled but louder than before. He smirked and made a show of the dance. Chuck didn't follow. He just turned slightly to keep Jay in view, like the needle of a compass, holding true no matter how the map changed around it. Then Chuck moved. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't a shuffle. Just a single, deliberate step forward. A shift of weight so small it could have been missed. But it wasn't missed. The room changed. The air felt heavier, like something had settled that no one could name. The front row leaned forward. A few people took shallow breaths, not sure why their hearts had picked up. Jay froze, just for a second. Then he scoffed and bounced again. Is that it? The question wasn't loud, but it carried. Chuck didn't answer. He didn't need to. His body had already spoken. He planted his feet again, and the silence deepened. Jay charged in a quick step, then pulled back before contact. A test. A tease. His hands came up. His shoulders rolled, and he tried to fill the air with motion. But Chuck didn't chase, didn't react. Instead, he breathed. He couldn't hear it, but he could feel it. Like the ground beneath his soles drew something deeper than breath. Like his chest wasn't just rising and falling, but listening, feeling, rooting. Jay began to sweat. Not much. Just a bead or two near his temple. He wasn't tired. He was confused. The older man hadn't thrown a single strike, but something about him felt immovable, like he belonged to the center of the mat, and the rest of the room was just orbiting. The veterans in the crowd knew what they were seeing. It wasn't a stance. It was present. Years of training forged into something that didn't need to perform to be understood. Jay threw another feint, this time closer, sharp enough to cut the space. He was trying to provoke, to draw Chuck out. But Chuck stayed centered. He wasn't avoiding. He wasn't frozen. He was grounded. The kind of grounding that comes from discipline, from knowing your breath better than your limbs, from understanding that movement is cheap when intention is missing. Jay moved again. Faster now. He circled. He ducked. He threw another fake and snapped back. Nothing from Chuck. Only the quiet weight of stillness. That's when the difference became clear. Jay's motion was noise. Chuck's stillness was a signal. And every heartbeat in that room started listening to the signal. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was clear. Jay Carter was moving. Chuck Norris was becoming the ground he stood on. And the storm hadn't even started. Jay Carter came in fast legs, pumping chin down, hands tight. He launched a right cross with all the sharpness his coach drilled into him. It was fast. It was clean. It should have made contact. But it didn't. Chuck didn't block it. He didn't duck. He moved just enough. A small, lean, a shift of weight, a half inch, that made the punch slice into nothing. Jay stumbled forward, slightly surprised. His foot landed a beat late. His rhythm faltered. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They watched. Jay reset, shook it off. Tried again. A kick this time. High and wide. Chuck didn't move early. He didn't flinch. He waited. And just before impact, he stepped. Not back. Not forward. To the side. The kick missed completely. Jay turned midair and landed hard, catching his breath. Chuck was already still again. Jay grinned through his teeth, trying to cover it. He nodded, circle dropped into a lower stance. His hands twitched. He pumped his fist once, twice, then shot in again. This time he threw 3 punches in a row. Fast, angled, one up top, one to the side, one low. Chuck waited, watched, moved once. All 3 strikes missed. He didn't dodge. He timed. Jay staggered backward. His hands fell a little before he caught himself. He exhaled hard through his nose. He wasn't tired. But something was slipping. The crowd murmured now. Not loud, just a low wave of sound. A few leaned forward. Someone whispered to a neighbor. No one looked away. Jay bounced again, but slower now. The spring was still there, but the ease was gone. Chuck hadn't raised a hand. He hadn't thrown a punch. But every movement Jay made felt heavier, because it kept missing. Jay charged again, this time with feints. Left, then right, then left again. He spun, kicked low, then twisted high. Chuck stepped once. A pivot. A breath. Jay landed nothing. The crowd shifted. They weren't cheering. They weren't clapping. They were learning. Because this wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. Jay started breathing louder. His chest rose and fell faster. His moves were still crisp, still fast, but they were chasing something now. Chuck stood like a stone between waves. Jay snarled and lunged again. Chuck turned his foot slightly. Just that. Jay missed, and for a second he lost his balance. The mat under him wasn't moving, but it felt like it was. Chuck looked at him, not with a challenge, not with pride, with patience. Jay snapped a jab at the air. Chuck didn't blink. Jay snapped another, missed again. Chuck stepped forward. Not fast, not threatening, just enough. Jay stepped back. Then he shook his head and tried to laugh it off. But his eyes kept glancing at Chuck's feet. They hadn't moved much, but when they did, everything shifted. The room felt it too. The way older folks feel a storm before the wind picks up. The way soldiers feel quiet before the first shot. Chuck wasn't blocking, wasn't countering. He was listening. Not to Jay's words, not to the crowd, to time. Jay threw a spinning elbow. It was his signature, his highlight move. Chuck leaned, one step back. Jay missed again. He stumbled, this time for real. Chuck didn't move in, didn't punish him. He waited. Jay caught his breath, shoulders heaving, eyes narrowing. He wasn't losing points. There was no scoreboard. But he was losing something else. Control, rhythm, time. Chuck still hadn't struck, but he had landed something with every dodge, every pause, every pivot. Jay growled. He shouted something. But it didn't matter. Chuck stood calmly. And Jay's movements grew louder, sloppier, desperate. The match had begun with noise, but now the silence was winning. Jay Carter's heel slipped. It was subtle, just a quarter turn too wide. But the moment his foot touched down, the angle was wrong. His weight chased after it. His shoulder leaned too far. His elbow dropped an inch too low. It wasn't a fall, but it wasn't clean either. Chuck didn't react. He didn't move in or take advantage. He just turned slightly. A small pivot. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to let Jay's stumble become a spin. Jay twisted halfway around, arms open to reset, but his balance had already left him. Chuck took one step to the side and waited. Jay steadied himself. Eyes are sharp now. Anger is creeping in at the edges. He came in again with a sweeping motion, trying to reset the pace. He spun low, foot carving a half circle across the mat. Chuck stepped back, silent. Jay's leg hit air. His planted foot skidded slightly as he caught himself, arms swinging out to stabilize. The veterans in the front row leaned in. They'd seen it before. Different time, different battlefield. When a man keeps moving faster, thinking speed will save him. But the ground keeps slipping. Jay exhaled hard. He shook out his hands, raised them again. He rushed forward, feinted high, then ducked low. Chuck moved almost not at all. But Jay missed again. And this time, he nearly tripped over his own step. The room didn't cheer. No one laughed. The silence deepened. Chuck watched. He wasn't reading Jay's strikes. He was reading his center. Every shift in weight, every intention telegraphed through the spine, every imbalance is waiting to happen. Jay jabbed again, fast and tight. Chuck leaned his head slightly, just enough. Jay stumbled forward from the empty strike. Not a slip, but close. His hands came up to guard again, but it was too late. Chuck didn't touch him. Didn't need to. Jay was already losing ground. He circled now, more cautious. His feet are wider. His breathing is shorter. He was starting to feel it, not in his muscles, but in his mind. Chuck wasn't blocking. Chuck wasn't fighting. Chuck was letting him fall forward. Jay swung hard. Chuck took one pivot. Jay spun again. Off balance. He caught himself with a wide step foot scraping the edge of the mat. Chuck stepped in, then stopped. That pause landed heavier than a strike. Jay's eyes flashed. He lunged again, wild now. Chuck stepped away. Jay fell to one knee. The room froze. Chuck didn't move. Jay stood slowly, face red, chest heaving. He wasn't hurt, not physically, but something was coming apart. He looked at Chuck like a man looking for a wall to push against, but finding only air. Every time Jay attacked, Chuck gave him nothing to land on, and that emptiness was heavier than force. Chuck walked one slow circle, hands still down. He wasn't showing dominance. He was showing patience. Jay circled again. Slower. Unsure. He launched one more strike. It cut through the air like a knife meant for a ghost. Chuck stepped aside. Jay spun halfway around, feet tangled. His balance is left again. He grunted, caught himself, and backed up. He looked around, at the mat, at the crowd. No one spoke. The audience had become part of the stillness. They weren't watching a match. They were watching a man unravel. Chuck had not thrown a single punch, but Jay had landed on nothing. Again and again, the old men in the hall saw it. They didn't smile. They didn't gloat. They just nodded, because they knew. This was not domination. This was understanding. Jay had power. Chuck had poise. Jay had speed. Chuck had space. Jay fought to hit something. Chuck simply let the target move away. It was a quiet kind of mastery, the kind that doesn't raise its voice, the kind that waits for the storm to wear itself out. And now Jay stood in the center, chest rising, arms limp, feet unsure. And Chuck waited. Still. Balanced. The storm was almost done. Chuck stopped moving. He stood in the center of the mat, feet, firm shoulders, relaxed hands by his sides. Not ready to strike. Not ready to run. Just ready. Jay Carter slowed his steps. His breathing was shallow now, not from exhaustion, but from something else. He circled again, tighter this time, trying to read the silence, trying to decode it. His hands were up, but not steady. Chuck didn't follow, didn't watch, didn't flinch. He simply was. And that stillness grew heavier with every breath. Jay's feet tapped against the mat, light and quick, a rhythm he couldn't break. He threw a half feint, then stepped back. Nothing. He shifted again. Still nothing. Chuck's eyes didn't even narrow. There was no fight left in the movement, no energy left in the noise. Jay turned his head, glancing toward the crowd. No help, no sound. The room was watching, but not for entertainment anymore. Something else had taken hold. Jay stepped forward, then stopped. His weight shifted, but he didn't know where to place it. His stance was loose. His confidence was gone. He stood 5 feet from a man who hadn't raised a hand, yet somehow had taken everything from him. Chuck blinked once, then not again. Jay threw out a jab, not to hit, just to make something happen. Chuck didn't react. The jab faded into the air, like it had no place to land. Jay dropped his arms for a moment. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in confusion. What am I doing? He took 1 step back. Chuck remained. The silence felt louder than any shout. Jay could feel the sweat on his skin, cooling and sticking. His mouth was dry, but he didn't want to swallow. His eyes darted toward the door. He didn't want to run, but he didn't know how to stay. This wasn't about punches anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't even about Chuck. It was about him. And whatever this moment was demanding from him. It wasn't strength. It wasn't speed. It wasn't pride. It was stillness. Jay had never trained for that. Chuck stood like a stone underwater, immovable, quiet, timeless. Jay stepped again, slower this time. He walked in a full circle, then another. The space around Chuck seemed different, like it belonged to something older, something sacred. Jay tried to find anger, but it wasn't there, only quiet. He realized his fists were no longer clenched. His feet weren't moving on purpose. They were stalling. He looked into Chuck's eyes. There was no challenge in them, only clarity. And Jay suddenly felt small, not weak, not unworthy, just unfinished. He lowered his guard. Silence accepted it. Chuck hadn't spoken, hadn't struck, but something had been said, something deep, something final. Jay took 1 more step. Then he stopped. He breathed in, and for the first time, he stood still. Chuck took 1 final step. It was quiet, slow and sure, just a footfall, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before. The mat didn't shake. The room didn't breathe. But something in the air turned. He walked toward Jay. No tension, no speed, just presence. Jay didn't back away. He didn't lift his arms. His hands stayed at his sides, empty, now unsure. His breath caught as Chuck approached, but not from fear. Something older was settling into him. Chuck stopped in front of him. They stood close enough for Jay to see the years in Chuck's eyes. Not age, experience, steady, lived-in calm. The kind that doesn't chase time, it outlasts it. Chuck lifted his hand. No fist, no blade, just an open palm, steady and warm. He reached out and placed it gently on Jay's chest, right over the heart. Jay didn't flinch. He didn't feel pain, no pressure, no strike, just the touch. And it broke something. Not bones, not pride, ego. Jay's knees gave, but not from force. His body folded, slow and quiet. Not a fall. A kneeling, as if his legs had finally caught up to what his spirit already knew. His head bowed. He wasn't defeated. He was revealed. Chuck left his hand there a moment longer, then stepped back. The room didn't erupt. No applause, no roar, just silence. And in that stillness, something sacred happened. Not in words, not in action, in understanding. Jay knelt, breathing steady eyes, closed. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't afraid. He was present. He had entered the mat, full of fire, full of certainty, full of self. But now he saw. He saw what strength really looked like. Not in strikes, in stillness, not in power, in presence, not in proving, in peace. Chuck said nothing. He didn't need to. Jay heard everything. The veterans in the crowd stayed silent. A few nodded. One wiped his eye. Another placed a hand on his own chest. Not out of sorrow, but memory. They had seen this before. Not in fights, in life, when a man meets something greater than himself and chooses to listen. Jay slowly looked up. His eyes met Chuck's. They were clear now, not wide with youth, open with respect. Chuck offered no hand, no gesture. He just stood. And in that moment, Jay understood the truth. The match had never been about winning. It had always been about learning. Chuck turned and walked away. No cheers followed, only stillness. Jay remained on his knees a little longer, not because he had lost, because he had arrived. The match had ended, but no one moved. There was no cheering, no clapping, no music, just the steady weight of silence pressing gently against the walls of the Legion Hall. Jay remained on his knees. Chuck stood in front of him, still as stone, his hands by his sides. He looked down without judgment, only with quiet presence, the kind that asked nothing and gave everything. A few breaths passed before Chuck bent slightly and extended a hand. Jay looked up uncertain for just a moment, then reached out. Their hands met not like opponents, but like something older. Teacher and student, man and man. Chuck helped him to his feet with no effort, no show of strength. Then he let go. Jay stood not tall, not proud, but changed. The crowd did not stir. Not one soul in the room reached for their phone. No one broke the silence. A few veterans sat straighter. One old Marine placed his cap over his heart, not out of protocol, out of respect. Chuck gave a small nod, not to the crowd, not to Jay, to the moment. Then he turned and stepped away. Jay watched him go. His hands hung loose. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something. But there were no words that would have fit. So he didn't speak. He just stood in the center of the mat, surrounded by people who were not looking at him, but through him, watching something more than a fight unfold. The silence grew longer. Not awkward. Holy. Like what happens after a prayer, or a promise, or a burial. Jay walked slowly toward the edge of the mat. Each step was measured. Careful. Not because his body hurt, but because his soul was adjusting. Like he had stepped into a different kind of light and was learning how to see. He passed by the veterans in the front row. One of them nodded. Another gave the faintest touch to his own knee, a gesture of shared ground. Jay didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just kept walking. Toward the door. Toward air. Toward silence that would follow him home. Behind him, Chuck was already sitting again. Same chair. Same position. It was as if he had never left it. The younger fighters, who'd been loud earlier, now sat quietly. A few looked down at their own hands, like they were seeing them for the first time. No one dared speak. Jay reached the exit. He paused, turned once, and looked at the room. He didn't speak. But in his face, there was something new. Not regret. Not sorrow. Reflection. He stepped out into the sun, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Inside, no one moved, because something sacred had just passed through. The lights in the Legion Hall had dimmed long after sunset. Most folks had gone home hours earlier. A few stayed behind to fold chairs, stack water bottles, and sweep scattered dust from the mat. One of the volunteers, a quiet woman in her 60s named Carla, was rolling up the last edge of the practice floor when she spotted something near the center. It was a piece of folded paper. She picked it up gently, noticing the creases were deliberate. The handwriting on the front was simple. Just one name. Chuck. She paused for a second, then walked it to the nearest folding table. The room was still and cool. She opened it slowly. The paper was firm, and the ink was still fresh. Inside was a note. A letter, really, written in Jay's hand. The tone wasn't dramatic. It wasn't for attention. It read like someone writing what they'd waited too long to say. Carla read it once, then again. She didn't cry, but she stayed very still. The note said, "I didn't know who you were." Not really. I thought maybe just an old guy with a quiet stare. Maybe a name someone else built up for stories. I figured if I was loud enough, fast enough, people would notice me instead. And they did for a while. I thought strength was about pressure, about impact, about making people move because you said so. But you didn't move anyone. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't raise your fists. You just stood there and let the storm die out. I've trained for years. Speed, reflex, power. But no one taught me how to hold still. No one taught me that presence could be louder than force. You did that without saying a word. And when you touched my chest, it wasn't an attack. It was the first time I realized someone saw straight through me. You didn't beat me. You invited me to face myself. I thought I needed to win. Turns out, I needed to understand. Thank you. Carla folded the paper again, slower this time. She placed it back on the table and looked at the mat. It was just vinyl, stretched tight. But something sacred had happened there, and this letter made it real. It wasn't just written to Chuck. It was written to every elder who had ever been dismissed, to every quiet man who had been mocked by noise, to every woman who had waited for a son or a student or a stranger to finally see. It was an apology, but also a turning. A younger man stepping forward not to challenge, but to listen. Carla didn't speak. She just let the words settle. The mat had been cleaned. The lights would be shut off soon. But something in that hall would stay. A note, a lesson, and the sound of one generation saying to another, "I see you now." The sun was barely up when Jay stepped through the doors of the small dojo. The wooden floors creaked under his shoes. He looked around quietly. There was no one else there yet, just dust floating in shafts of morning light. It smelled like cedar and sweat and something older than either. Chuck was in the back, already moving through slow, steady motions. His body flowed without sound. Jay didn't interrupt. When Chuck noticed him, he didn't speak. Jay didn't ask for anything. No lessons, no rematch, no talk of redemption. He simply said he'd like to help clean. Chuck nodded once, then handed him a broom. Jay took it without hesitation. He swept. That was the beginning. He returned the next day, and the next. He scrubbed the mats, wiped down the mirrors, took out the trash, polished the corners that most people never looked at. Chuck never gave him praise, never explained anything. But Jay kept coming back. It became a rhythm. Quiet mornings, long silences, small movements that began to feel sacred. Chuck moved the same way every day. No wasted steps, no noise. And Jay watched. After 2 weeks, Chuck paused one morning and adjusted Jay's shoulders. No words, just a touch and a nod. Jay straightened, breathed in. Something shifted. The next day, Chuck showed him how to stand. Not with force, with awareness. Feet flat, shoulders soft, back aligned. Jay listened, not just with his ears, but his whole frame. Then came breathing, deep and slow, not for calm, for connection, with self, with the room, with the silence. Jay began to understand it wasn't about mastering anyone else. It was about mastering yourself. He didn't miss the flashy strikes or shouting crowds. He didn't crave attention. He started to look forward to sweeping the floors. Each pass of the broom gave him more peace than any trophy had. Chuck never rushed. Some days they didn't speak at all. Just moved, just breathed, just cleaned. And that was enough. Jay found himself smiling more, laughing less. Not out of sadness, but out of something clearer. He was learning. Not just techniques, but trust, patience, humility. There were no belts here, no points to earn, just presence. Jay realized the dojo was less a place and more a way of walking, of watching, of living. He had once thought martial arts were about power, but now, sweeping the floor in silence beside a man who had once brought him to his knees without a single punch, he knew better. They were about peace, and he was just beginning. Chuck stepped out of the Legion Hall just as the sky began to soften. The wind moved slowly across the lot. Gravel crunched under his boots. He kept his hands in his pockets, his head low, not out of shame, but habit. He didn't rush. A few people waited near the curb. They weren't reporters, just locals, a couple of veterans, one mother holding her son's hand. The boy had seen everything. His eyes were wide with that kind of awe only children still believe in. Chuck gave a small nod. Warm. Simple. No handshake. No photos. Just a smile that said more than words. The mother smiled back. The boy stood still, holding his breath, like he was in the presence of something he hadn't yet learned how to name. Chuck passed them gently, kept walking, down the sidewalk, past the faded flagpole, toward his truck parked under a cottonwood tree that had seen more years than most men ever do. He drove without music, just the hum of tires and time. Windows cracked, air clean. The town passed slowly. Small shops, empty benches, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention. By the time he reached the dojo, the sun was hanging low. Orange light spilled across the floorboards. He pushed the door open without sound. Inside it was already alive. Jay stood near the front, not in a uniform, just a worn t-shirt and loose pants. He held a mop in one hand, but paused when Chuck walked in. Their eyes met. Jay smiled. Not the wide grin of a man who won something, the quiet curve of someone who'd finally stopped needing to. Chuck gave a nod. Jay went back to cleaning. A few kids were warming up in the back. Soft chatter. Feet on the mat. The room smelled of pine and sweat and polish. Jay finished up and called the group over. He didn't call it class. He called it time. He stood in the center barefoot, looked at the small circle of new faces. He didn't talk about black belts or championships or trophies. He said, "What matters isn't what you can do in here. It's what you stop yourself from doing out there." One of the kids tilted his head, not quite understanding. Jay didn't explain. He just motioned for them to line up. They started with posture. Not punches, not kicks, just learning how to stand. Chuck sat in the back, same old bench, same corner, watching. He didn't give notes, didn't interrupt. He was just there. Jay moved through the room, slowly guiding. A light touch on a shoulder. A small nod to a boy who held his breath too long. No raised voice. No fast corrections. He had learned well. Chuck leaned back slightly. Let his eyes wander across the old walls the way the sun brushed over wood. He remembered his own first days. The awkward stances. The hunger to prove. The silence of his teacher, who once said nothing for 3 whole weeks before correcting a single mistake. He smiled at the memory. Then something tugged at his attention. From the far edge of the mat, a little girl stepped forward, maybe 6 years old. Her hair was tied back with a red ribbon. She walked slowly toward Chuck. He didn't move, just watched. She stopped a few feet away, bowed low. He waited a moment, then bowed back, gentle and deep. She grinned, then turned and ran back to the group. Jay gave her a wink. She fell into place beside the others. Chuck looked down at the floor for a moment, Let the silence settle. Outside, the sun finally touched the hills, the room filled with soft breath and quiet steps. No one filmed it. No one clapped. But something lasting was being planted. A way, a rhythm, a whisper. That's how legends really pass on. Not through noise, through presence, and through those who know how to bow back when it matters most.